Samuel P. Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations? Essay, first published in Foreign Affairs in 1993, is one of the most influential and controversial contributions to political science and international relations of the late 20th century. The essay argues that the primary sources of conflict in the post-Cold War world will no longer be ideological or economic, but cultural. Huntington posits that the globe is divided into distinct civilizations, and the clash between these civilizations will shape future conflicts. Background of Huntington's thesis. At the time Huntington's essay was written, the world was still processing the end of the Cold War. Many scholars and policymakers were debating what the new world order would look like without the bipolar struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. One of the most prominent ideas circulating at the time was Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis, which argued that liberal democracy had triumphed and would become the universal form of governance. Fukuyama envisioned a peaceful global order based on democratic capitalism. Huntington, however, saw the world differently. In his view, the fall of communism had not eliminated the potential for global conflict. Instead, the new sources of conflict would emerge along cultural fault lines. He argued that civilizations, rather than nation-states or ideologies, would be the primary actors in future conflicts. His essay challenges the optimism of the post-Cold War era by asserting that cultural differences would continue to divide the world. Huntington's definition of civilization. Central to Huntington's thesis is his concept of civilization. He defines civilizations as the highest cultural grouping of people and the broadest level of cultural identity people have. Civilizations are distinguished by elements such as religion, history, language, and customs. Unlike nations, civilizations are larger and more enduring, and they often transcend borders. Huntington identifies several major civilizations in the contemporary world, including Western, Confucian, Japanese, Islamic, Hindu, Slavic Orthodox, Latin American, and possibly African. He argues that the differences between these civilizations are more fundamental than those between political ideologies or economic systems, and that these differences will be the primary source of conflict in the future. The role of religion in civilizational identity. One of the central components of Huntington's concept of civilization is religion. He believes that religion is a critical factor in defining civilizations and that religious differences are often at the heart of civilizational clashes. For instance, the Western civilization is largely shaped by Christianity, while the Islamic civilization is rooted in Islam, and the Confucian civilization in East Asia is informed by Confucianism and Buddhism. Huntington argues that while economic or ideological differences can be negotiated or compromised, religious and cultural differences are far more resistant to change. These deep-seated differences, he contends, will lead to increased tensions and clashes between civilizations, especially in areas where civilizations meet and intermingle. The fault lines of civilization. A significant aspect of Huntington's thesis is the idea of fault lines between civilizations. He predicts that conflicts in the post-Cold War world will primarily occur along these fault lines, where different civilizations come into contact. These fault lines are often geographic borders, but they can also be internal fault lines within countries that contain multiple civilizations. Huntington points to examples such as the Balkan conflicts of the 1990s, where Orthodox Christian Serbs, Catholic Croats, and Muslim Bosniaks clashed along civilizational lines. He also highlights the potential for conflict between the West and the Islamic world, which he argues have fundamentally different worldviews that are likely to lead to confrontation. Western Universalism versus civilizational pluralism. Huntington critiques the idea of Western Universalism, the notion that Western values, particularly liberal democracy and human rights, are universally applicable and desirable. He argues that the West's efforts to spread its values around the world will provoke resistance from other civilizations, especially those with different cultural and religious foundations. According to Huntington, non-Western civilizations will increasingly reject Western ideals and instead emphasize their own cultural identities. This rejection of Westernization, he argues, will further deepen the divide between civilizations. For instance, Huntington suggests that the rise of Islamic fundamentalism can be seen as a reaction against Western cultural dominance. Huntington calls for a recognition of civilizational pluralism, in which different civilizations accept that they have distinct values and worldviews and agree to coexist without trying to impose their systems on others. He argues that a stable world order must be based on the acceptance of cultural diversity rather than the imposition of Western norms. In-country syndrome. One of the key concepts introduced by Huntington in his essay is the idea of kin-country syndrome. This refers to the tendency of countries from the same civilization to rally to each other's support in times of conflict. He argues that in future conflicts, countries will align based on cultural and civilizational ties rather than political or ideological ones. For example, Huntington points to the Gulf War of 1991, in which many Islamic countries expressed solidarity with Iraq, despite Saddam Hussein's autocratic regime, because of a shared Islamic identity. Huntington predicts that this kin country syndrome will become more common in the future, as civilizations coalesce around shared cultural identities. Criticism of Huntington's thesis. While Huntington's essay sparked widespread discussion and debate, it has also faced significant criticism from scholars and policymakers. One of the primary critiques is that Huntington's concept of civilization is overly simplistic and essentialist. Critics argue that civilizations are not monolithic entities, but rather complex and internally diverse. For instance, within the Islamic world, there are vast differences between Sunni and Shia Muslims, and within the West, there are significant cultural variations between Europe and North America. Another criticism is that Huntington underestimates the role of economic and political factors in shaping global conflicts. Critics argue that many of the conflicts Huntington attributes to civilizational clashes are actually driven by economic or geopolitical interests. For example, some argue that the conflicts in the Middle East are more about control of resources like oil than about cultural or religious differences. Furthermore, some scholars contend that Huntington's thesis is overly deterministic and pessimistic. By framing civilizations as fundamentally at odds with one another, Huntington's essay may contribute to a self-fulfilling prophecy, encouraging policymakers to view global politics through a lens of inevitable conflict. Huntington's influence on post-9/11 discourse. Huntington's thesis gained renewed attention after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. In the aftermath of the attacks, many commentators and policymakers invoked the idea of a clash between the West and Islam to explain the rise of Islamic terrorism. Huntington's emphasis on the incompatibility of Western and Islamic civilizations resonated with those who viewed the attacks as part of a broader civilizational struggle. However, others cautioned against using Huntington's thesis to oversimplify the causes of terrorism. They argued that reducing complex issues like terrorism to a clash of civilizations obscured the role of political, social, and economic factors. Additionally, some critics warned that adopting a civilizational framework could exacerbate tensions between the West and the Islamic world by promoting a view of inherent conflict. In conclusion, Samuel P. Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations remains one of the most influential and debated essays in the field of international relations. Huntington's argument that cultural and civilizational differences will drive global conflicts in the post-Cold War world challenges the optimism of those who believed in a peaceful, universal order. While his thesis has been both praised and criticized, its lasting impact on discussions of global politics is undeniable. Huntington's essay forces us to confront the deep cultural divisions that continue to shape the world today, even as we seek ways to manage and mitigate those divisions in the pursuit of peace and stability.